We often think of trauma as a deeply personal wound, something each of us carries alone. But what if humanity itself shares a collective wound? What if the echoes of wars, genocides, colonization, and slavery aren't just confined to history books, but are living, breathing forces that shape our present? These events don't just vanish with time. They leave deep psychic and emotional imprints that are passed down through generations. From a psychospiritual perspective, these imprints can organize themselves into what are known as egregores, vast, collective fields of consciousness fueled by shared emotions like fear, guilt, hatred, or the thirst for power. Today, we're going to explore how shadow work, the process of confronting our inner darkness, becomes a crucial tool. It helps us understand how these collective traumas form, how they influence our minds, and how healing our world truly begins with healing ourselves. First, let's define collective trauma. It happens when a large group of people faces overwhelming violence that shatters their ability to make sense of the world. Think of the Holocaust, the transatlantic slave trade, or the destruction of indigenous cultures. These events create a deep rupture in our fundamental trust in others, trust in society, and sometimes even trust in life itself. And even when the direct witnesses are gone, the trauma lingers. It's transmitted through the silences in our families, the untold stories, the inherited anxieties. It's embedded in our social structures like systemic inequalities and in our national myths. Modern science is catching up, with fields like epigenetics showing how trauma can literally alter our biology and be passed down. On a more subtle level, this trauma is also transmitted through these powerful collective fields of consciousness. So how do these traumatic events crystallize into egregores? It begins with the event itself, which generates a massive emotional charge, terror, rage, despair. This is followed by mental repetition as we create stories, memorials, and rituals around the trauma. Finally, there's a symbolic fixation where specific dates, places, or even entire groups of people become forever linked to the event. When these three elements, intense emotion, mental repetition, and symbolic fixation, are sustained over a long time, they coalesce into a traumatic egregore. An egregore like this has its own kind of life. It possesses an autonomous emotional memory, meaning it remembers the original pain. It has a powerful tendency to repeat itself, a kind of historical compulsion that pushes societies to reenact old conflicts. It thrives on a polarized worldview of victims and perpetrators, and it carries an unconscious need for justification or revenge. These fields become the invisible puppet masters influencing our political ideologies, our geopolitical conflicts, our national identities, and our relationships between different groups. Let's look at some specific examples. Wars create egregores built on the glorification of sacrifice and the dehumanization of the enemy. Even when peace is declared, the egregore of war can persist as a cultural fascination with violence, a collective paranoia, or a society that remains militarized in its thinking. Genocides produce incredibly dense and dark egregores. They are a tangled web of horror, collective guilt, and often of forced silence or denial. These fields can lead to entire identities being built around the wound of victimhood, creating a transmitted existential fear that makes it incredibly difficult to move past the roles of the persecuted or the aggressor. Similarly, colonization and slavery created egregores structured around the idea of a hierarchy of human worth. They are built on objectification, dispossession, and a toxic mix of internalized shame for the oppressed and repressed guilt for the oppressor. These fields are still active today, manifesting as systemic racism, identity conflicts, and unconscious biases that continue to shape our world. This is where shadow work comes in. As Carl Jung taught, shadow work is the process of bringing our repressed, unconscious parts into the light of awareness. But here's the key. Our personal shadow isn't just personal. It's often filled with collectively inherited baggage. A traumatic egregore can show up in an individual as irrational fears you can't explain, disproportionate emotional reactions to certain triggers, or an invisible loyalty to a historical narrative you've unconsciously adopted. And what we don't consciously recognize within ourselves, we project onto others. We project our unhealed wounds onto groups we perceive as a threat, onto political figures who become stand-ins for our inner demons, or onto symbolic enemies that allow us to avoid looking at our own shadow. In this way, the egregore feeds on the unintegrated shadow of individuals, and in turn, individuals remain trapped in the egregore's repetitive cycle. The collective drama is fueled by our personal unconsciousness. So, how do we break this cycle? The key lies in understanding a fundamental principle. An egregore only has power as long as it is fueled by our unconscious identification with it. Healing the individual is the first step to transforming collective memory. When an individual decides to do their inner work, when they acknowledge the inherited trauma without becoming it, when they feel the ancient emotion without projecting it onto someone else, when they understand the historical mechanism without needing a scapegoat, they stop feeding that collective traumatic field. They pull their psychic energy back. Every single person who works through their inherited fear, who disarms their transgenerational anger, who transforms their shame or guilt into clear-eyed understanding, becomes a point of transmutation for the entire collective. Real collective healing doesn't happen because of a government decree or a new ideology. It happens when a critical mass of individuals integrates their own consciousness. This process is a kind of collective alchemy. The goal isn't to forget history, but to de-identify from it. We want to be able to remember without repeating, to honor the past without being frozen by it, to transmit the lessons without imprisoning future generations in the same old conflicts. An integrated memory is no longer a source of revenge. It becomes a source of wisdom. This work requires a new kind of ethics. It demands that we refuse simplistic narratives of pure victims and evil perpetrators. It asks us to recognize the complexity in all human groups and to accept that every culture, every nation, and every one of us carries both shadow and light. It is a challenging path because it means giving up the comfort of moral innocence and the rigidity of fixed identities. The egregores born from our darkest historical moments are not abstract theories. They live and breathe through our unexamined fears, our righteous anger, and our unconscious identifications. Shadow work shows us that collective healing never begins out there in the world. It begins right here in the quiet intimacy of your own consciousness. Healing yourself is not an act of turning your back on the world's problems. It is the most radical form of activism there is. It's the act of withdrawing the very psychic energy that keeps these destructive patterns alive. As more and more of us integrate our inherited shadow, the traumatic egregores begin to lose their grip. Collective memory can then finally transform from a heavy burden we're doomed to repeat into a profound wisdom that lights our way forward. This is how we, as a species, can finally stop reenacting our deepest wounds and begin, at long last, to transmute them. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. If this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share. Let's continue this vital conversation together.